to Mark's Gospel and chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, beginning to read from verse 22 through to verse 38. We've just been singing that God will open our eyes and our hearts to his word, and let's trust that by the Spirit he will teach us and show us through the reading of Scripture this morning. Mark chapter 8, reading from verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their own soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels." May God bless the reading of the word to our hearts.
Good morning again. Hello. It's good to hear there are people out there. You've heard enough about me, so I won't make any introductions. Except to say, I believe we have some special visitors with us, Mark and Sarah Payne. There we go, there they are. Were members of CCB many years ago, I believe in the 70s. I arrived in March, so that's a bit before me. But we want to wish you a warm welcome. Mark is now a rector in a church in the UK. So welcome back, and it's great to have you. I hope there are some familiar faces who will give you a very warm welcome over a cup of tea or coffee. You and everyone are invited to tea and coffee after the service. Please do join us. Please chat. Ask me a question about my sermon. Let's converse about the things of the Lord or about the week. But for now, let's get into it. Mark chapter 8. So our series is called Living the Easter Story. We're spending 3 weeks thinking about what it would be like for Easter to be part of our everyday and ordinary lives. And Easter is such a special thing. We treasure Easter and the events of Easter. The death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ mean the world to Christians. Remembering together those things every year at Easter is like a mountaintop experience. It's exciting. We think about love and sacrifice and mercy and justice. We think about the weakness and the power. We remember salvation and hope, full of all those good things. So if you're even half awake spiritually, if you have a drop of spiritual life in you, it's exciting to think about Jesus died and risen again. Our hearts and our minds race at Easter. But then life carries on. Your day will still start with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. You still have the same aches and pains. If you have a spouse, your relationship with them will still be less than perfect. The kids are still anxious, but there's still such a joy. You'll still enjoy some of your colleagues at work, and others will be just a pain in the neck. You'll still make plans next weekend. There'll still be a pile of dishes every evening, and maybe the night will end with a bit of series, and then you'll wander off to bed. And life just carries on. Easter seems so special, so exciting, so full of hope and salvation. Life seems so ordinary. And the two things can seem worlds apart. There's one story going on over here called Me and My Little Life, and there's one story over there called Jesus and the Great Salvation. He has won. And it seems that the two don't easily meet. As Dave said last week, it seems like what Jesus has done gives you a ticket into heaven or into the eternal life, which you just stick in your pocket and you keep with you, but it doesn't really change things now. It's got more to do with then, when you'll cash it in. But that's not so. What we're trying to do in this series is to show that the special, wonderful story of Easter can and does find its way into the story of your ordinary life. We're doing our best to help you see that the two narratives do come together, that the two plot lines, so to speak, do meet. So last week, if I may remind you briefly, you heard that as Paul says time and time again in his letters, you are in Christ. That means, Dave told us from Romans 6, that Christ has not only done something for you, but has also done something in you. When Christ died on the cross, you died with him. So that old power of sin that worked within your body, within you, is now dead and dying. And he told us that when Christ rose from the tomb, you rose with him. So there's now a new power of righteousness that is risen in you and rising in you. That is nature changing. It's transforming inwardly. It's the ultimate renovation project, and it's in you, and it is in Christ. So if you're united with Christ, then everything about your story and the way you are as a human being and your functioning has been changed by what happened that Easter. That's the first place the two plot lines meet. This week, we're going to talk about the end product of that transformation. So, we've heard that in Christ's death and resurrection, God has and is changing us. Now we try to think what he is changing us into, what our lives become more and more like. This is the second place the two plot lines meet. And this week has some serious bite. Our text gives us a pattern for life and tells us to live after that pattern. And the pattern is uncomfortable, and it's disturbing, and it's difficult. But sometimes when God speaks to disturb or in a way that is uncomfortable, it's because that's exactly what we need. We need actually to hear what we're going to hear this morning. I actually realized that at about 1:30 this morning, there was a loud scream from the bedroom nearby. The 8-month-old Joseph made his voice known, and I wasn't up for it. My feelings were not very positive. And I realized, I actually need this very much, and I'm sure so do you. So let me pray, and then we'll pick up the action in verse 22. Father, please help us, we ask, to hear what it is we're being transformed into, to hear about this cross and the lifestyle of the cross, and how the cross of Easter comes into our lives every day. Please show us Christ crucified. Reveal your glory this morning. Make us more like our Lord Jesus, we pray. Amen. Right, so we pick up the action in verse 22. This strange story of the healing of a blind man from Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man, says verse Jesus, and begged, says verse 22. Some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. But this story is a bit unusual because it takes two stages. Step one, Jesus puts his hands on him, verse 23, and asks him, "Do you see anything?" And the answer is not what you'd expect. He says, verse 24, "I see people, and they look like trees walking around." So he begins to see something. There's some vision, but it's murky and unclear and distorted. It's half clarity. Then step two, once more, verse 25, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. And then the verdict, then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Now, after the second step, he can see in full HD. Now he can see with clarity. It's not just the fuzzy outlines. Really, everything is clear to him. So the question you're left with when you read the story is like, why two steps? This is odd. Was Jesus running out of power? The man who could work all these incredible miracles through the story so far, is he losing his touch, or what's going on? That there's these two stages. Well, we don't really have time to answer that question because the story moves on, but we'll come back to it. Jesus carries on his journey. He's through the villages around Caesarea Philippi, and he asks a question. He asks his disciples a question. Who do people say I am? A big question. The most important question Jesus could ask. Perhaps you can hear the dramatic music beginning to build up in the background. In fact, Mark's whole story plays on the question, who is Jesus? So here is a high point in the story. Who do people say I am? And so they reply something like John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets. The people around Jesus seem to be perceiving him as someone who works miracles, like the prophets of the Old Testament. Now, that's who people say you are. But then the drama goes up a notch, and everybody's heart rate begins to race when Jesus focuses the attention. He puts the microscope right on the disciples. But what about you? Can you hear how emphatic his question is? What about you? Who do you say that I am? And it's always Peter. I'm not sure what kind of hothead he was born with. But it's always Peter. And Peter answers on behalf of the disciples. You are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. What is this Messiah? Peter is saying, you are the one to whom all the prophets pointed. Not just a prophet like John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the other ones, but the ones they spoke about. You're that one. You are the great Davidic king, the center of God's final victory. You are the centerpiece in his final program to restore his world and bring salvation. You're that king. You are the Messiah. Whoa, that is a big thing to say. And it is, because in verse 30, Jesus says, oh, hush, hush, don't tell anybody. Why does he say? Because it's hot. It's loaded. It's in fact even politically a loaded word. Peter is saying, you are God's king. Unlike the pretender Herod or the Romans who rule over us, you really are the one sent by God to rule, to bring God's salvation into the world. You're the one God is going to dethrone his opponents through and bring his kingdom through. You are the Messiah. It's a hot thing. But then the music dies. Jesus begins to speak plainly. He teaches, and he teaches about his identity. Verse 31. He began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's Jesus' favorite name for himself, so don't get confused by that. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise. Those are not words you were expecting to hear. A plot twist. The Messiah, God's victorious King, will suffer and be rejected and die. That's odd. Let's just think about that. The Messiah will die. Victory is going to come through his defeat. His salvation will come through condemnation. His power will be weakness. Not what Peter was expecting to hear. Not what you were expecting to hear. And so Peter takes Jesus off to one side to have, a brotherly conversation with the Lord of glory, to fix some of his misunderstandings about what it means to be the Messiah, to sort out some of his theology where it's gone astray. And the camera focuses in on Jesus and Peter and this conversation. Peter begins to rebuke him, verse 32. It's always Peter. Verse 33, Jesus doesn't take very well to this. He thinks there's something desperately wrong with what Peter's saying. He rebukes Peter. Look at the words in the second half of verse 33. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." He accuses Peter of being in league with the devil. You've joined forces with the evil one, with the Satan. Apparently, when Peter tries to correct Jesus' theology and say, no, the Messiah doesn't suffer, you're going to be conquering and you're going to make a big name for yourself and be glorious and victorious, that is satanic. Here's the problem. The world has joined the devil's upside-down scheme of self-glorifying power, self-glorifying force, self-aggrandizement, violence for self-gain. The world is satanically upside down, and so is Peter. But Jesus is opposing Satan's way by living right side up. He will deliberately choose the low road, the path of humility. Humble service comes first, and after that, God will glorify him in resurrection. Do you remember the story of the blind man? Remember the 2 stages? It was odd. Well, the first touch, the man could sort of see, yes, it's a parable. It's a lived parable. The man could sort of see. Yes, Peter can sort of see. So can the disciples. They can make out the outlines of who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. But the second touch is now given by Jesus. They don't just see that he's the Messiah, but what kind of Messiah he is. He is the suffering, rejected, and killed kind of Messiah. That's not what they were expecting, or what we would expect. But the story carries on. Now the cameras pan out, and you see that the whole time Jesus was having these private conversations with his disciples and with Peter, there was a whole crowd around them, a whole big group of people. And he calls the crowd to him, verse 34, along with his disciples, and he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." So here's the second point. If the first is that Jesus is the suffering, rejected, killed Messiah, and only after that risen, the second point is that Jesus' followers live cross-shaped lives. That's how the Easter story comes into our story. Our lives are shaped like the cross. Let's unpack some of those words. They must deny themselves. That is, we are called to empty ourselves of concerns for our personal glory or status or our own personal gain. They must take up their cross. That means you must take up the instrument of your execution and follow Jesus. I've been thinking for a long time about whether there is a good metaphor for what the cross means to people in the first century. And I finally, this week, in preparing for this very sermon, thought of one that's almost perfect. It's necklacing, you know, that horrible practice of filling a tire with petrol, putting it over somebody's head and setting it on fire. What Jesus is saying, that's what the cross is like. It's a brutal, cruel, shameful execution. What Jesus is saying, to be clear, is if you want to follow me, go get a tire, fill a jerry can with petrol, carry it around with you, and bring a box of matches. And then you can come and follow me. The world is going to stay upside down. They'll keep killing right ways up kind of people. What they did to me, says Jesus, they will do to you. So be ready. Deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Walk in the way I am about to walk. Take my identity as your identity. He doesn't call us to do something he hasn't done. He calls us simply to go in his way. So 2 questions. One question, who is Jesus? Another question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? They have the same answer. In both cases, the answer is the cross. Who is Jesus? Look to the cross. He's the suffering, rejected, killed Messiah. What does it mean to follow him? Look at the cross. It means to empty yourself, deny yourself. Take up that brutal thing and follow Jesus. To say, I am a Christian, is to say, I am crucified. In the Christian life, the way down to serve humbly is what comes first, and only then, at the return of our Lord, the way up in glory. Here's a very clever man, Professor Richard Hayes, probably not a model evangelical, but he puts it so well here. He says, to be Jesus' disciple means to allow one's own identity to be stamped by the identity of the one who died forsaken on the cross. When we embrace Mark's answer to the question, who do you say that I am? We are not just making a theological affirmation about Jesus' identity, we are choosing our own identity as well. That's true. So, how do we live the Easter story? What does it look like to live the Easter story? There's a way of being that tries to escape everything ordinary and mundane in life, tries to get away from it and escape it through celebrity and grandeur and being glorious and exalted. That's not our way of being. Our way of being is to choose not the way of glory and exaltation in the here and now, but it's to deny ourselves in humility and in service. So, the ordinary and the mundane of every day begs the question, how can I serve in this? Who can I serve in this? Where can I serve? How does this thing I'm doing now serve? So we see the mundane and the ordinary, the everyday of our lives. It's not something ugly to escape, to try find something better and more glorious and wonderful, but something actually beautiful. Am I allowed to say something spiritual? The ordinary is a place in which to live out a spiritual life of crucifixion. Another Bible scholar, Michael Gorman, calls this lifestyle cruciformity. It's a good word. Conformity to the cross, cruciformity. The pile of dishes, the weekend plans with friends, the spouse, the kids, the battle axe at work, the commute, the aches and pains, the budget. Can you see? All of those very ordinary things are flowering with beautiful opportunities to live in cruciformity, to ask, how can I serve? Where can I serve? How can I humbly help? Here's Michael Gorman quoted. To be in Christ is to be a living exegesis of the narrative of Christ, a new performance of the original drama of exaltation following humiliation, of humiliation as the voluntary renunciation of rights and selfish gain in order to serve and obey. It's a big mouthful, but he's right. Your life is to be every day a new performance of the Easter drama. Every day you live the cross, the way down, the way of humility, the way of self-denial, the way of service. And that way, every day your life is like a retelling of the Easter story, the retelling of Christ crucified. And your ordinary is filled with the spiritual life of the cross. That's how we live Easter every day. I want to speak about two things more specifically, though. Firstly, how does the Easter story shape my use of influence? We have some influential people here, I'm sure. A fair number, in fact, of us here this morning are influential. We have an education, or a certain role within a family, or a position in a company, or we have money, and there's some truth in the saying that money is power. And we have certain skills or talents that God has given us. And all of these things help us to be influential, to change the way people live, to change people's minds, to affect the world around us. And unfortunately, as we know very well, the ability to influence people most often has a bad influence on people. When you become influential or powerful, it usually has a bad effect on you, or at least it exposes what's already bad within you. You know the saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But to follow Jesus is to use whatever influence you have to serve with humility. You aren't using your influence to gain more influence. You know, that's how it normally works. If you're influential, you can just step on more people's heads so that you become more influential. That's how people live influentially. But that's not how it works. Those who follow Jesus don't step on the heads of others. You're going after Jesus with the cross in one hand and a generous dose of self-denial in the other hand. So if you have employees, please treat them like that. If you have family, please treat them like that. If we are your church, please treat us like that. Use your influence in a cruciform, a cross-shaped, humble, serving kind of way. How does the Easter story shape the church community we want to be? I remember I was once somewhere with a guy called Nathan Lovell. He's a lecturer at the Bible college I went to, George Whitfield College. I can't remember the setting. I can't remember what we were talking about. I have very little recollection of the conversation at all. But I do remember that somehow the subject turned to a certain ministry. I can't remember the ministry, so I can't even share some juicy gossip with you. I'm sorry. Someone in the conversation said, yeah, that's all quite spectacular, all very impressive. And I remember Nathan saying something like, now don't blame him for this if you don't like it. I've probably remembered it wrong. If you don't like it, it's my fault. But Nathan said something like, well, that's just the problem. Do you think that if the God of the Bible, the God of the crucifixion, were to do something in the world, it would look very impressive or spectacular or glorious? And that was a good question. A very good question. I'm not sure that our pursuit as a church, that our vision, that our desires together as a church family ought to be some enormous, glorious, all-conquering, spectacular thing. We must be very careful of ego and self-aggrandizement, and of trying to just pat ourselves on the back by doing something huge. What's the greatest church out there? You don't know it. Neither do I. And the reason we don't know it is because they're probably too busy serving one another and serving the neighborhood around them to have time to make a name for themselves. We've never heard of them. That's the greatest church out there. Here's my cheesy quote for the day. I stole half of it from Rick Warren, and it's dripping with cheese, but it's true. You don't measure a church by its seating capacity, but by its serving capacity. That's how it is. There's a sense, I guess, in which that's glorious and great and very impressive, but it's not the usual sense. Instead, imagine with me what it would be like to be not just a few individual people who live the life shaped after the cross, but to be a whole community, a family of people that was shaped by the cross. A church community which served one another and served the neighborhood around us in humility and in sacrifice. Imagine how sweet and wonderful and enjoyable the fellowship would be if we had denied ourselves and taken up the instruments of our execution and served one another and served our community. Imagine a community who turned the kind of people who just wanted to be humble servants into its leaders. That's the church. That's what we ought to be like. If we strive to be anything, let's be that and see what God does with it. Right, well, we've come a long way this morning, and I think we have a lot to think about. Let me just remind you, here's what I hope you got out of all of it. The cross the story of Easter can and must make its way into your everyday life. The plot line of your life can be met by the great story of Easter, particularly the cross. The cross of Easter, the cross of Christ at Easter challenges us, shapes our lives. To go in the way of the cross is to deny self, choosing humility and service. It is to take up the instrument of your execution, ready to die with Jesus for his cause, because we live right ways up in a world upside down, and to follow him in cruciformity. Let me pray. Father, please shape us. Shape us in our hearts in that which we desire, and shape us in our minds in that which we think. Make our whole beings to be cross-shaped, even our actions, even the emotions we feel when we're irritated in the middle of the night. May our ordinary, everyday, and really quite mundane lives be filled with the story of Easter, with the spirituality of the cross. Please, Father, make us a family of servants, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to sing